Part two, and I'll share my screen. And I'm sorry, my face is still appearing up in the corner. It shouldn't be, but it is. Still have to stare at me. I set out on my trip through North America's national parks from my home at Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota on the southern fringe of the North American boreal forest. This forest is one of the largest stretches of woodland in the world. It spreads from the Aleutian Islands all the way to Newfoundland and from the southern edge of Hudson Bay to North Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. As I headed west for Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, the taiga gave way to grasslands and oak savanna near Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. By the time I crossed the Red River, I'd left the forest behind altogether. I felt the land dip and look west, and looking west, I thought I could make out the horizon where the Great Plains began. As a boy, I would accompany my father on business trips through these same landscapes. In the car, he would narrate the history of our region, mostly without much emotional inflection. Chief Little Crow fled this way to escape the military after the Dakota War in 1862. We would pass many small towns, Holly, Valley City, Medina, Steele, that seemed pleasant enough until my father ruined them for me. The calm and order of them, their small houses and neatly kept yards, the Protestant ethic reflected in their organization. All of it infuriates me because every single one of those towns exists at our expense. Medora, North Dakota, is the southern gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The Marquis de Mores named the town after his wife, Medora von Hoffman, though the romance of the gesture suffers when you consider that he established the town as a place to slaughter cattle to be sold at Eastern markets. Medora today is a fantasy of time that never was. There is a statue of Roosevelt in a Rough Riders hotel, and during the summer months, the Medora musical. The show's website really says it's best when it promises the rootin' tootin'est boot scootin'est show in the Midwest. There's no other show quite like it, and it's an ode to patriotism, Theodore Roosevelt and the great American West. When I was there, it was an ode to COVID-19. According to a clerk at the convenience store, one of the cast members was spreading the virus from the stage. I wanted to begin my journey at Theodore Roosevelt because no one embodies the tensions of the park system as it is currently constituted, like the 26th president. Contained in the person of Roosevelt was a wild love for natural vistas and a propensity for violent imperialism, an overwhelming desire for freedom, and a readiness to take away from other people. Much of the park named after him exists on top of Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, MHA land. The MHA lost that land in 1851 with the signing of the first treaty of Fort Laramie. Executive orders in 1870 and 1880 seized still more of the tribe's homeland. Roosevelt went to hunt bison in Dakota Territory in 1883. In 1884, when he was back home in New York, his wife gave birth to their daughter, Alice. But unbeknownst to her doctors, his wife had a kidney ailment and died on Valentine's Day that year. Teddy's mother died the same day in the same house. After drawing a large X in his diary, Roosevelt wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." He returned to the West and built a ranch outside Medora, intent on letting nature soothe him. He didn't last long out there, and the West never became his permanent home, but it left a mark on him, and he, in turn, left a mark on it. Roosevelt was familiar with Native Americans, having interacted with them when he was in Dakota Territory. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian, he would say in an 1886 speech, during which he also famously declared, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. Roosevelt's attitude toward Indians is manifest in his treatment of the Apache leader Geronimo. Born in 1829, Geronimo lived in the first 3 decades of his life in the peace and security of his Apache homelands in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. In the second half of the 19th century, he rose to international fame for fighting the American and Mexican governments in an attempt to preserve his tribe's peace of the Southwest. In 1858, the year of Roosevelt's birth, Geronimo joined a large trading party that left the Mogollon Mountains and entered Mexico. While he was in town conducting business, his band was attacked and slaughtered at camp. Among the dead were Geronimo's wife, mother, and 3 small children. He later recalled, "I did not pray, nor did I resolve to do anything in particular, for I had no purpose left." Life for him, as recounted by Gilbert King in Smithsonian Magazine, shaded from peace into a state of perpetual warfare, ending only with his capture by U.S. forces in 1886, around the time Roosevelt was mourning in Dakota Territory. Geronimo was shipped east and spent the rest of his life in captivity, and his tribe's land was whittled away. Around the same time, Native children were also being shipped away from their homelands to government-sponsored boarding schools. Removed from their families and their culture so as to mainstream them, attendance was sometimes mandated by law and sometimes coerced, but it was rarely strictly voluntary. For speaking in their own language, the children were sometimes beaten or had soap put in their mouths. Of the 112 Apache children from Geronimo's band sent to the Carlisle Island Industrial School in Pennsylvania, 36 died, most of them likely from tuberculosis, and were buried there. For his part, Geronimo did get out under guard once in a while, including a stint in 1904 as part of the Apache village at the St. Louis World's Fair, where he was made to play the role of the savage. In 1905, he and other Native leaders were asked to be part of Roosevelt's inaugural parade. It was a who's who of tribal leadership, including Quanah Parker, Comanche, Buckskin Charlie, Ute, Hollow Horn Bear, Brule Lakota, American Horse, Oglala Lakota, and Little Plume, Pagan Blackfeet. They rode horses down Pennsylvania Avenue in regalia not entirely in step with their individual tribal traditions. America liked and still likes its Indians to function much like its nature, frozen in time, outside history, the antithesis, or at best the outer limit of humanity and civilization. Geronimo met with Roosevelt afterward. "Take the ropes from our hands," he begged in desperate appeal to be allowed to return, along with other Apache prisoners, to his homeland. Roosevelt declined, telling him, "You killed many of my people. You burned villages." Geronimo began to gesture and yell, but was cut off. 4 years later, he died in captivity at Fort Still, Oklahoma. In 1903, Roosevelt had let himself be drawn back west. In April of that year, he embarked on a 14,000-mile train journey that took him 24 states and territories in 9 weeks. He traveled to Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon in California, where he enjoyed a 3-night camping trip with John Muir. Along the way, Roosevelt gave speeches at the Grand Canyon, at Yellowstone, where he laid the cornerstone for the Roosevelt Arch, near some redwoods in Santa Cruz. He said much about the majesty of nature. Regarding the Grand Canyon, "I want to ask you to do one thing in connection with it in your own interest, and in the interest of the country. To keep this great wonder of nature as it is now. I hope you will not have a building of any kind, not a summer cottage, a hotel, or anything else, to mar the wonderful grandeur, the sublimity, the great loneliness and beauty of the canyon." And Yellowstone, the Yellowstone Park is something absolutely unique in the world, so far as I know. The scheme of its preservation is noteworthy in its essential democracy. This park was created and is now administered for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Roosevelt translated his passions into policy. During his time in office, he created 150 national forests, 18 national monuments, 5 national parks, 4 national game preserves, and 51 bird reservations. Like Geronimo, Roosevelt came of age during a pivotal 50-year stretch when the contiguous United States assumed its final dimensions. The last major armed conflict between a native tribe and the U.S. government ended at Wounded Knee Creek, with the massacre of as many as 300 men, women, and children of Spotted Elk's band of Miniconjou. The frontier was pushed all the way to the Pacific and then was no more. And America's truly wild space, land outside the embrace of civilization, was subsumed. The American West began with the war, but concluded with the parks. 2. The future of the tribes and the parks. The MHA Nation lives just north and a little east of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, but under drastically different circumstances than the people in and around Medora. Time and time again, the MHA reservation was reduced by federal fiat and exploitative deals, from more than 12 million acres to less than 1 million. The dispossessions continued well into the 20th century. During construction of the Garrison Dam and Reservoir in the Missouri River in the 1940s and 50s, up to 80% of the reservation population was forced to relocate away from the fertile river bottoms that had given them life and defined them as a people for centuries. In the 1860s, long before the dam was built, the MHA had lived mostly at a place called Little A Fishhook Village. Royce Young Wolf, the collections manager at a new cultural center the MHA are building, told me, "It's all under the lake now, flooded out," she said. "We're standing at Oxbow Overlook inside the park, looking down at the Little Missouri River as it wound lazily through acres of cottonwood and grassy clearings. They were self-sufficient," she said. "Each village had its own garden. Many families had sacred bundle keepers. The dam was planned without any meaningful consultation of the MHA Nation. After the Army Corps of Engineers threatened to confiscate the land it needed, citing eminent domain, the tribes had little choice but to come to a negotiating table and eventually cede territory. By 1949, they had received settlements totaling only 12.6 million for the more than 150,000 acres that were taken. "They moved us from where the water was plentiful to where there wasn't any," Young Wolf said. "Our river bottoms were the most fertile in the whole state. But when we were flooded, we were moved to areas where there's poor soil and no water, and we couldn't sustain large gardens. The tribe's right to the use of the land in the reservoir shoreline for hunting or fishing or planting, gathering, were denied. In recent years, the MHA have been in the grip of a rapid, violent, and remunerative, geez Louise, fracking enterprises. As I drove north from the park, I saw land bearing scars, pipes, gas vents, fracking pads dotting the hills. In 2014, the former tribal chair, Tex Hall, promised the tribes sovereignty by the barrel, and he wasn't wrong. The tribes are wealthier than they have been since before the first treaty of Fort Laramie, but by encouraging and facilitating oil extraction, they put themselves at odds with their own cultural legacy and connection to the land. Native American nations such as the MHA are in a difficult position. They have endured state-sponsored assaults on their families, communities, land, and ways of life. Their traditional political structure and institutions have suffered under the paternalism of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which controls native land by holding it in trust. On one hand, we are sovereign nations with our own laws and law enforcement, courts, and municipal infrastructures, all derived from those rights that we have managed to retain. Contrary to popular myth, neither casinos nor the right to gamble were given to tribes as a kind of pity payment or the recognition of a debt owed to us. The casino industry is a modern expression of a civil right to gamble that we had before white people came along, a right we have retained, and that was affirmed by the Supreme Court. On the other hand, without a strong tax base or much commerce, extractive industries, casino gambling, tax-free cigarette sales are notable exceptions. We are dependent on federal support for education, healthcare, infrastructure, and our continued survival. We are, in the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, domestic dependent nations, and thus live in constant tension. The MHA have had their struggles with unemployment, substance abuse, a destructive marriage to the oil and gas industry, and intergenerational trauma inflicted by the US government. But tribes are much more than the sum of their troubles. The MHA are also keenly protective of their heritage and culture. The cultural center they are constructing is a state-of-the-art facility in service to these ideals. The MHA Interpretive Center is on Army Corps of Engineers land because that land is near the river, which is so essential to MHA history, Delphine Baker, the director of the Interpretive Center, told me. She was instantly recognizable to me as a kind of fierce, no-nonsense native auntie. Government officials didn't want the tribes to own that land, she said matter-of-factly. The tribes now hold a lease instead, out of a concern that the tribes would take control of recreation rights and not allow tribal members to have access. The tribe is never interested in blocking access, but that's a fear. The facility is gorgeous, swooping embankments and curving walks mirror the rolling hills and grasslands of the MHA tribal area. Inside is a partial replica of an earth lodge, the traditional dwelling of the three tribes, and gallery space that tells the story of the MHA. The Interpretive Center will be the home for hundreds, if not thousands, of artifacts taken from the tribes over the years. And it will not be merely a show and tell of kind of endeavor. The center will cultivate traditional plants in a rooftop garden. A cafe will serve traditional foods. There is a recording studio for preserving tribal languages, and a research space where tribal members will be able to trace their lineage. For so many Native people who have been separated from their tribes because of federal meddling, reconnecting is an important service the center can provide. To call this an interpretive center isn't quite right. It's more like a cultural mothership. My God, Cyrus, stop. If you lose your culture, you lose your sovereignty and your tribe, Baker told me, and that's what we're fighting for. It's not the first such fight. During the early reservation period, a difficult and fractious time when the people at like a fishhook village were trying to figure out a new way of living, a splinter group wanted to hunt and garden in the old communal ways. So they left, relocating outside the reservation about 120 miles upriver. That group became known as the Shoshoga, and they were led by Crow Flies High and Bobtail Bull. Young Wolf told me. When they separated, they were taking a stand against assimilation and Christianity. They stayed away for over 20 years. They revived ceremonies and songs and dances. They preserved knowledge of local plants. While they were gone, Young Wolf said the community of Like a Fishhook Village suffered from being split apart in small plots of land. But the Shoshoga kept our traditions safe while they were away. And it's because of them we have many of our traditions today. In 1894, the government forced Shoshka back to the reservation. They were treated badly at first by many of the MHA members who had stayed behind, Young Wolf told me. They were looked at as backwards and savage. But now to be Shoshka is to be connected to the land, to tradition, and to a spirit of resistance. The Shoshka were saved by their land, and their return to it saved their tribe. The first park person I met on my trip was Grant Geis, then the chief ranger at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. He's since retired. Geis is tall and broad-shouldered with a rugged face and large, strong hands. He'd been at the park since 1998, when he started as a seasonal employee. As soon as I hit Painted Canyon, I fell in love with it, he told me, and I've kind of been here ever since. Pretty much every person I talked with in the Park Service used the word love to describe the parks, the vistas, and their own roles as protectors of the land and its visitors. In my experience, that's not a word most government employees use when talking about their job. I asked Geis about Teddy Roosevelt and his legacy. He was a firm believer in the land of many uses, but at the same time trying to save something for future generations, Geis replied. It says something about his character when he was forward-thinking to that degree. He also acknowledged Roosevelt's imperfections and expressed support for cooperative relationships between parks and adjacent tribes. The personal failings of people like Roosevelt are still codified in American policy, a lack of access to land, and the lack of power that such access would confer undergirds the social ills that affect many Native peoples. But At least in some places, American attitudes are changing, and in the parks, policies are changing too, albeit slowly, and in piecemeal fashion. When I was a kid, and my parents took my siblings and me on our first trip out west in the early 80s, we stopped at Theodore Roosevelt, Custer Battlefield, now Little Bighorn, Yellowstone, and Grand Teton. Indians were barely mentioned on the signage, and I don't remember meeting any native rangers or even sensing that we existed as anything other than America's past tense. But since the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, tribes and parks, not to mention museums, galleries, and private collections, have drawn closer together in their efforts to preserve Native spaces and objects. Many tribes now have historic preservation officers who work with the parks. Land use itself is also changing within the parks to some degree. For instance, the Park Service has made it easier for Native people to harvest plants for traditional purposes, though typically they first have to submit a written request. And some parks allow us to hunt or trap within their borders. In some respects, ours is an era of Native resurgence. For all we have suffered, there remains 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. When the first national parks were created at the end of the 19th century, only about 250,000 Native people were left in the U.S. Now there are more than 5 million Native Americans throughout the country, roughly equal to that number of Jewish Americans, and millions more than the number of Muslim Americans. Our survival hasn't mattered only to us. As the efforts to assimilate us largely failed and we remained mostly in our homelands, Americans have gradually assimilated to our cultures, our worldview, and our modes of connecting to nature. The parks enshrine places, but they also emphasize and prioritize a particular way of interacting with the land. In the nation's mythic past, the wilderness may have been a dangerous environment, something to be tamed, plowed under, cut down. But the way of relating to the land is no longer in vogue. For many Americans, our wild spaces are a solace, a refuge, cathedrals indeed. America has succeeded in becoming more Indian over the past 245 years rather than the other way around. It took me a few days to hike the south unit of Theodore Roosevelt. Unlike more congested parks such as Yellowstone and Yosemite, Roosevelt is quiet, so much so that it feels like a secret. I started in high, red, dusty hills and descended through a series of washes and dry river bottoms. I keenly felt how far back in time I was traveling with each step. The trail rose past the petrified tree stumps of a swamp millions of years old and out onto grassy plains, where the wind screamed through the grass, echinacea, aster, and goldenrod. I passed near cliffs where the tribes might once have funneled stampeding bison, causing them to fall to the hard earth below. The day after I finished my hike, I had breakfast with Wendy Ross, the park superintendent, in Theodore's dining room at the Rough Riders Hotel. I asked her whether Native people should be able to use the park differently than non-natives, considering our long tenure on the land, which had originally been part of the MHA's tribal homeland. Why, I asked, couldn't the MHA hunt the bison in the park? Ross said it was something of a slippery slope. If the park allowed Native people to hunt bison, the rest of the residents of Dakota would throw a fit, of North Dakota would throw a fit, and more troubling, the efforts of hunting groups to open up parks across the country to sport hunting would be greatly encouraged. The problem, Ross said, is that there are no protocols nationally, and hence there's much confusion. Here at Roosevelt, I've told all of my staff, we let anybody in who says they're coming in for ceremony or spiritual purposes. I have no doubt this is true. Ross seems to be a good leader and an ally to the tribes who live near Roosevelt. She spoke of reparations, of providing what you can to people who used to use that area all the time, and then expanding that to other Native peoples. She has been attending tribal meetings. Superintendents like Ross are changing the parks to better meet the needs of Native nations, but they can do only so much. So far, reparations are partial, ad hoc, and tenuous, always subject to reversal. Native peoples need permanent, unencumbered access to our homelands in order to strengthen us and our communities and to undo some of the damage of the preceding centuries. Being native is not so much a disposition or having a certain amount of blood running through one's veins as it is a practice around which families and tribes are built. For a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, buying a bison burger at Whole Foods might satisfy their caloric needs, but being able to hunt and harvest bison in keeping with their spiritual and cultural practices feeds their culture and community. Native life was diminished when our land disappeared beneath our feet, and it is further diminished when the manner in which we access public lands is scripted by the government. The preservation of these sublime places for future generations is, of course, crucially important, something Native Americans understand as deeply as anyone. But putting aside for a moment the interests of Native Americans, and notwithstanding the hard work and goodwill of many parks employees, the parks show worrying signs of mismanagement. Myopic decisions have seemed to proliferate, and some protected natural species become political footballs. Bears Ears National Monument in southeastern Utah was signed into being by President Barack Obama before he left office. 1 year later, President Donald Trump reduced Bear Ears by 85% from 1.4 million acres to just over 200,000. This move left archaeological and sacred sites at the mercy of mining operations and motor vehicles. And while it's likely to be reversed by the Biden administration, possibly quite soon, it augurs poorly for the future. Although the Department of the Interior will soon benefit from the leadership of Deb Haaland, who recently became the first Native American cabinet secretary, it has typically lacked for innovation in recent years. As Jeff Roosh, a director of the nonprofit Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, has written, most parks merely Xerox forward old plans, adjusting as they go. Most of this is done without fresh thinking on conservation. National parks are withering as a result of overcrowding, habitat loss, and what Roosh calls a science deficit. Even as attendance has increased, park staff has been shrinking, as has the influence of scientists within the Park Service. Roosh's assessment doesn't make the Park Service sound like the protective arm of a powerful government safeguarding its best idea. Parks, as they've existed for 149 years, have done a decent job of preserving the past, but it's not clear that today's model of care and custodianship best meets the needs of the land, Native people, or the general public, nor is it clear that the current system will adequately ensure the park's future. That's something Indians are good at, pushing ahead while bringing the past along with us. We may be able to chart a better way forward. All 85 million acres of national park sites should be turned over to a consortium of federally recognized tribes in the United States. A few areas run by National Park Service, such as the National Mall, would be accepted. The total acreage would not quite make up for the General Allotment Act, which robbed us of 90 million acres, but it would ensure that we have unfettered access to our tribal homelands, and it would restore dignity that was rightfully ours. To be entrusted with the stewardship of America's most precious landscapes would be a deeply meaningful form of restitution, alongside the feelings of awe that Americans experience while contemplating the God Rock of Yosemite and other places like it. We could take inspiration in having done right by one another. Placing these lands under collective Native control would be good not just for Natives, but for the parks as well. In addition to our deep and abiding reverence for wild spaces, tribes have a long history of administering to widely dispersed holdings and dealings with layers of bureaucracy. Many reservations are checkerboarded. Large parcels of reservation land are scattered and separated from one another, and much of the land within reservation boundaries owned by a number of different interests. Private, non-tribal citizens, corporations, state, the federal government, that tribal leadership balances and accommodates. Through hard practice and in the face of centuries of legal, political, and physical struggle, Indian communities have become adept at the art of governance, and tribes have a hard-earned understanding of the ways in which land empowers the people it sustains. Transferring the parks to the tribes would protect them from partisan back and forth in Washington. And the transfer would subject to binding covenants guaranteeing a standard of conservation that is at least as stringent as what the park system enforces today, so that the park's ecological health would be preserved and improved long into the future. The federal government should continue to offer some financial support for park maintenance in order to keep fees low for visitors, and the tribes would continue to allow universal access to parks in perpetuity. Bikers and toddlers, Instagram models, and Tony Hawk all would be welcome. We would govern these beautiful places for ourselves, but also for all Americans. There is precedent for this kind of transfer. The indigenous peoples of Australia and New Zealand now control some of those countries' most significant natural landmarks. For instance, Uluru, previously called Ayers Rock, was transferred to the Anangu people decades ago. Thanks to legislation passed in 1976, nearly half of the Northern Territory of Australia has been returned to the Aboriginal peoples. In 2017, New Zealand's Maori people were granted a greater role in the conservation of the Wanganui River on New Zealand's North Island. The public is still free to visit as before, but the Maori are now have oversight of the use of the river. There is a precedent for this kind of transfer in America too. In 1880, France began work on the Panama Canal, which the United States took over in 1904. Theodore Roosevelt, he keeps coming up, wanted to see it through, and so he worked out a deal with Panamanian nationalists, whereby the U.S. would receive the canal in exchange for help overthrowing the Colombian government. But in 1977, President Jimmy Carter and General Omar Torrijos of Panama signed an agreement that outlined the transfer of control of the canal to Panama. The canal was jointly managed by two countries until 1999, when control reverted fully and finally back to Panama. It doesn't happen often, but the United States has given things back. In 1914, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that American democracy was forged on the frontier. It was there that the uniquely American mixture of egalitarianism, self-reliance, and individualism commingled to form the nation and its character. American democracy, he said, was born of no theorist's dream. It came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. Turner was almost right. It wasn't the frontier that made us as much as the land itself. Land that has always been native land, but that has also come to be American. The national parks are the closest thing America has to sacred lands, and like the frontier of old, they can help forge our democracy anew. More than just America's best idea, the parks are the best of America, the jewels of its landscape. It's time they were returned to America's original peoples.